They say a mother's love is the one thing you can count on. But Lydia Marine had never known that kind of love. Not when she was 12 and her dresses no longer fit like the neighbor girls. Not when her father passed and her mother started measuring mouths and waistlines more than she measured kindness. And certainly not the day her own mama Chin, lifted lips tight, led her to the steps of a stranger's ranch and said, "Take her. She eats too much and earns too little." Just like that, Lydia stopped being a daughter. She became something to be traded, a punishment, a burden, an object in a world too cruel for softness. But here's the thing, folks missed while they stared at her. Size Lydia had never stopped being good. She still said thank you even when it hurt, still mended torn shirts not hers, still sang quietly to herself while sweeping someone else's floor. Because even if no one saw her worth, she would not unsee it herself. Until one man did. Walter Kane was a quiet rancher, bought his land for a single silver dollar and a dream no one quite understood. People said he had ghosts, that he talked more to trees than townsfolk. But when he saw Lydia round quiet Lydia standing barefoot with calloused hands and downcast eyes, he didn't flinch. He didn't laugh. He just said, "You don't owe me nothing, but if you'd like to stay, I'd be glad for the company." That was the beginning, but not the whole story, because what grew between them wasn't sudden. It was like desert rain, rare slow, but enough to make wildflowers bloom where folks thought nothing ever could. So what happened next? Did Lydia learn to trust again? Did Walter ever speak of his ghosts? And what did the word belonging finally come to mean for a woman who'd never truly had a home? The air in Dustwater didn't move much that morning. It sat heavy like everything else in Lydia Marine's life, thick, unmoving, too ashamed to breathe. She sat silent in a chair that wasn't hers on a porch, that wasn't hers, listening to her mother negotiate her weight like cattle. Her mother's voice rang sharp and matter-of-fact. "She's too big for any decent man, but she's strong, won't die in childbirth. You want a worker, not a showpiece." Lydia didn't flinch. She'd stopped flinching years ago. At 52, she had weathered storms no one had written songs about. Childhood hunger, a marriage arranged and then canceled when the groom saw her frame, years caring for her father while her mother ran off with men who never stayed. Now with her father buried and her mother's debts piling like bad crops, Lydia was the last thing of value left. So they sold her to a ranch hand named Walter Kane, who'd paid $5 silver and a sack of flour just to get someone to cook and clean his lonely outpost miles from town. No one asked Lydia if she agreed, but she rose from the porch, tied her hair, and stepped down the stairs. With dignity, because though they had priced her flesh, they had never measured her soul. Hook ket thux fan one. What waited at the edge of the prairie wasn't kindness, but it wasn't cruelty either, just silence and a chance to begin again. The wagon creaked beneath her, the road dry and broken. Dust clung to Lydia's skirts, her lashes, even the corners of her mouth, but she didn't wipe it away. It was nothing compared to the grime of being bartered like salt pork. Walter Kane didn't say a word during the 2-hour ride. He was a man of few movements, fewer words. Leathered hands, eyes the color of dusk. Not cruel, just worn. His silence was neither punishment nor indifference. It was habit, like brushing a horse or sharpening a blade. When they arrived at his ranch, Lydia expected a back room or a cot behind the stove. Instead, he stepped aside and motioned to the cabin door. "You eat when you're ready," he said simply. "There's stew left." The cabin wasn't fancy, but clean. One large room fire already lit a quilt folded near the hearth. On the table sat a bowl of spoon and a fresh slice of bread still warm. Lydia didn't cry. She didn't know how anymore. But something inside her loosened like the top button of a too-tight collar. That night she slept on a real bed. Not straw, not floorboards. A bed. She expected him to knock to demand something, but no one came. Just the wind outside, and her own breath finally steady. He didn't ask where she came from. He didn't ask what she could do, but he left the door unlocked. And that somehow said everything. Morning came with the scent of sagebrush and wood smoke. Lydia rose before the sun, a habit from years of chores she was never thanked for. She found the kitchen broom and began sweeping the cabin's wooden floor slowly, with care as if the sound itself could soothe the bones. Walter was already outside tending the horses. He didn't watch her, but he noticed the fresh coffee waiting by the door. They settled into a rhythm that had no instruction, only instinct. Lydia patched worn curtains. He fixed the gate latch. She kneaded bread with soft hands that remembered comfort. He mended a saddle and left it beside the porch without a word. But the silence held weight too familiar. Not unkind, but also not trusting. Because beneath Lydia's quiet movements was a heart still bracing. She didn't know how to accept kindness without suspicion. She couldn't yet believe she was safe, that he wasn't just waiting for her to earn the space she occupied. One evening she caught her reflection in the window and almost turned away. But then she looked again. Her dress was clean. Her face, though lined, looked calm, and she realized she wasn't holding her breath anymore. Later, Walter walked past the porch where she sat peeling apples. "You don't have to cook," he said. Then after a pause, "But I'm glad you do. Just that." And her hands stilled. Not because it was romantic, but because it was the first time someone had ever noticed her without asking something in return. The wind carried a letter before the woman came. Lydia found it folded on the porch bench, tucked under a horseshoe nail. One look at the handwriting and her stomach turned to dust. Mother, not Mama, not Ma. The kind of mother who wrote her name like a title. The kind who didn't ask if you were alive, only whether you still obeyed. The letter said she was coming, that she'd heard of Lydia's new situation, that a debt was owed, that she would collect. Lydia sat at the table long after the lamp burned low, clutching that paper like it still had heat. The next day she told Walter. She expected him to say, "You can't stay," or worse, "I never meant to keep you." But all he said was, "Do you want me here when she arrives?" Lydia didn't answer. She just nodded and something in her loosened. The mother arrived on a Sunday, in silks with perfume too thick for the land, dragging a suitcase and a lawyer. She sat at Walter's table like it was hers, unfurled a contract like it was scripture, and pointed at Lydia like she was still a girl to be bartered. She was sold, the woman said, but not properly transferred. Walter stood then. "No one owns her," he said. "She's not for sale, and she never was. Not here." Silence hung like dust in a barn after the door slams. Then Lydia rose, not trembling, not shrinking, and said softly, "I'm not going with you. Not now, not ever again." Her mother scoffed, but the woman's power slipped like heat off tin. That night Lydia placed the unsigned contract into the stove. It burned like a ribbon of old shame, and when Walter came back from the barn she looked at him and said, "I think I'd like to repaint the porch." It wasn't a declaration, but it was the first thing she chose without fear. The contract burned, but the past leaves, ashes, some that settle, some that still sting when stirred. They didn't speak of the visit again, not out loud, but it lingered in the walls. In the way Lydia touched the broom handle with hesitation, as if afraid she'd overstep. In the way Walter left the door open now, like he was trying not to cage her in. There was kindness between them, a rhythm, mended shirts folded on his bedpost, a tin of salve for her cracked hands left by his boots. And yet something pulled Lydia sideways every time she neared peace. Late one dusk, while they shelled beans in silence, she finally said it. "I don't know how to be wanted." Walter didn't blink. He just nodded slow as dusk settling over wheat and replied, "I didn't know how to be alone. Then I was." They sat like that, truce between them like lanterns lit for the first time. A week later she found a mirror in the storage room, cracked on the edge, dusty with old breath. She stared at herself a long time. Not the weight, not the softness, but the woman who had endured years of being made to feel like less. She took it outside and washed it clean. And when Walter caught her, their sunlight glinting off glass, he asked, "See anything worth keeping?" She didn't answer right away, just turned the mirror slightly until his reflection stood beside hers. Then said quietly, "Maybe." But that night under a quilt stitched from his late wife's old clothes, she couldn't sleep. Because it wasn't just Walter she was beginning to trust. It was herself. And that was the hardest part of all. She'd burned the contract. But old wounds don't vanish, they wait, whisper, and test the weight of new love. It started with a storm. Not the kind that rattles windows or tears through fence lines. No, this storm came in a dress. A floral one, with a ribbon at the waist. Her mother. Just walked up the path like she still owned the world, like she hadn't bartered her daughter for 3 barrels of oats and the favor of silence. Lydia stood on the porch. She didn't cry, didn't run. She just watched the woman who once called her a burden in lace step down from a buckboard like nothing had passed between them but Sunday tea. "I came to fetch you," her mother said flatly. "There's no sense playing wife to a servant." Walter had come out by then, quiet, watchful. But Lydia raised one hand and whispered, "Stay." Her mother's eyes narrowed. "You don't belong here." Lydia took a breath so deep it scraped the bottom of her soul. "I didn't belong there either." Her voice didn't shake. Her hands didn't fidget. "I am not a sack of potatoes you get to sell twice." Her mother laughed brittle. "So you think this man wants you for anything more than what I gave him?" Walter stepped forward then, not with fists, not with fury, but with something harder to argue, a chair. He pulled it out beside Lydia, sat, and said, "I'm not here to take her. I'm here if she stays. Not possession, not defense, just presence." Lydia turned back to her mother. "This is where I choose." The woman sputtered, muttered something cruel, but Lydia had already turned away, back into the home she had helped rebuild, back into the kitchen that now smelled of rosemary and warmth. And as she leaned against the table, hands trembling only slightly, she whispered to herself, "I am not shame." And for the first time in her life, she believed it. She stood her ground. But healing isn't just about what you walk away from, it's what you walk toward. The days that followed weren't loud. They were not fireworks or sudden declarations. They were quiet things, steady things. A mug placed by her hand each morning before she reached the stove. Walter already up, already thinking of her first. A shawl draped on her shoulders before dusk settled its chill. A porch board finally fixed without her asking. And then one soft evening, she found something carved into the beam above the hearth. A single word, "ours." Not mine, not hers, but a middle ground they had built together. That night, as the wind curled itself like a sleepy dog around the chimney, Lydia sat in her rocking chair with a quilt pulled up to her chest and a heart finally quiet. Walter sat across from her. His book was open, but his eyes were on her. He didn't ask. He just waited. And Lydia, who had spent half her life apologizing for being heavy, for being too much, too quiet, too difficult to love, simply said, "Yes." No ring, no audience, just a decision honest as breath. They married under the peach tree come spring, and when folks from town whispered about how odd it all was, the children who came to their door for fresh milk, warm bread, and stories didn't seem to mind. Years passed. The house grew laughter. Lydia grew herbs and sunflowers and the kind of joy that needed no explanation. She wasn't bought. She wasn't claimed. She was chosen, every morning, by the same man, in the smallest ways. And when strangers asked her how it happened, she would smile, soft, sure, and say, "He saw me." That's all. That's everything. She wasn't saved. She bloomed because someone stayed long enough to see her open. There are people who all their lives only wish for one simple thing to be seen, not by their appearance, age, or what others say, but by who they are, kind, quiet, and always trying, even though their hearts have been rejected many times. Lydia used to be such a person. But sometimes all it takes is someone quiet enough to listen, gentle enough not to push away, and brave enough to love a wounded soul. Then miracles will happen. And as Lydia and Walter learned, love doesn't need a theater. It just needs a porch that's quiet enough, a hand that doesn't ask for anything, and a heart that knows how to stay. Have you ever been someone who silently endures like Lydia? Or have you ever found peace in an unexpected place? If this story touches you, subscribe to the channel None, Wild West Saga, so you don't miss other gentle slices of the wild but kind West. Want to see a sequel or more heartwarming stories like this? Leave a comment below. We're always reading and always listening. Thank you for sticking around until the end. May you always find a place for your soul.